Hello and welcome to WOLV TV Spotlight. I'm Sean Henderson, and today I am joined by an incredible guest, writer and director Maegan Houang. Maegan was named to Filmmaker Magazine's 2023 list of fresh faces in independent film, and she has worked in nearly all aspects of the film and TV world, with her short film Astonishing Little Feat, her work on the show Shōgun, which won a record number of Emmys, and working on music videos for artists like Mitski. Maegan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I feel like it's impossible to open this conversation any other way than talking about Shōgun. That was one of the biggest hits of 2024, won a record amount of Emmys with 18. Congratulations, I first want to say. And I want to talk about your work on that show. You were a story editor for a number of episodes, and you wrote 2 of them, notably the finale. And I was interested in learning a little bit about just writing a finale, because you're trying to wrap up some storylines, some character arcs, but also tee it off for the second season that'll be coming out soon.
Well, the first thing I would say is that we had no idea that we would have a second season. So we definitely didn't write the finale thinking that we were teeing anything up, which we just finished the season 2 writer's room. So it's been a fun experience. The thing about television is it's such a group project that it doesn't really feel like anything's necessarily my specific episode or anyone else's specific episode. We really broke all of the episodes together. And then, we get assigned different episodes. But writing the finale was just really fun. I had a great time, and I really loved writing with my co-writer, Emily Yoshida, and we just sort of, did our best to have a conclusion to the show. I really like the ending of the book, which I think that we kept pretty intact, which is this idea that Blackthorn is really a pawn within Toranaga's world, and he's not in as much control as he thought he was, and that's really faithful to the book in a way that I'm proud that we kept.
Yeah, and staying on Blackthorn, as you just mentioned, I feel like we see a different version of him than we're first introduced to in the show's first episode. And, you've obviously worked with his development throughout the first season. Can you tell me a little bit about how you think he's changed from when we first meet him in the pilot to the end of season 1?
Yeah, I think Blackthorn goes on a journey of accepting that he isn't necessarily the center of his own narrative. It's not about just him, that there are all these other players, including mostly the Japanese people that he interacts with in the world at large. And I think that's a lot of the journey that he goes on, especially by losing someone that is so close to him. You just sort of, when that happens to you, understand that, you can't necessarily completely forge your own fate. You also have to just accept what happens to you.
Yeah, I think that's especially evident when we see him ask Fuji to stay at the end of season 1, because that moment I feel like you didn't really expect to see when they first interact at the beginning, and he doesn't really want her presence. So I think his development is just incredible to watch throughout the season.
Yeah, he really grows.
And staying on the note of character, I found that there are just fascinating characters across the cast, because some kind of are in a bit of a morally gray space, some are in conflict with each other, and others facing internal conflicts. Was there any one character for you that was kind of really interesting to develop throughout the season?
I love a lot of the characters. I often would fight for, Emily and I really fought for Toranaga to have scenes alone in the finale where he's just swimming. It's something that was in the book that we just really liked, that he has these kind of introspective moments alone. I really love Mariko, like everyone probably does. She's probably the strongest character in my opinion, probably partially because of Anna Sawai's performance. And of course, like everyone else, I also love Yabushige, who I think really goes on the craziest journey of all for the audience, where he begins the season boiling someone and then becomes people's favorite character, even though he's a very morally gray villain, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I love all the characters. I'm sad we had to lose some for season 2, but we have some really exciting new ones.
Yeah, there were definitely some times when I was like, I don't know if I feel great about their fate here, but I hope they stay around. And I agree, Yabushige definitely someday I didn't find myself expecting to really enjoy by the end of the season.
Tadanobu Asano is just a genius. We're just so lucky we got to have him in the show.
And going back to your different roles as story editor and just writer for the show, can you tell me a little bit about the differences in your day-to-day when serving in one capacity versus the other?
Yeah, so it worked pretty much like a normal writer's room, where we would meet every day in a room with a giant cork board, and then we would break story together by Justin and Rachel had kind of already broken up the book into sections of approximately where episodes would be. And so then we would just break the episodes, put the scenes up, we'd all kind of say which scenes we thought were interesting in the book, and then we'd adapt them, and then we'd have to add a lot new scenes. For anyone who's read the book, the second half of our season, episode 6 through 8 is pretty different from the book, and then 9 gets a lot closer, and then 10 diverges a little bit. But 9 is pretty faithful to what happened. So it was kind of balancing that. So we break the story together. We do all the cards, doing the beats, and then people are assigned an episode. So when you're on script, I was at home writing for 2 weeks, and then I come back and we do a notes process as a group. And then, that's basically the process, just going in back and forth of the room and being at home writing or working as a group. But it is very much a group project with the leadership of the showrunner.
Yeah, no, it seems like even like you were saying, when you're writing one episode, that doesn't mean you're not involved in a different one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, to go to Shōgun's wider impact, as I mentioned in the beginning, won a record 18 Emmys, which is incredible. And I think this is coming at a time when stories focused on Asian characters are really having kind of this moment, this breakthrough. You've seen movies like Parasite, Everything Everywhere All at Once, receiving countless accolades, and now Shōgun with its Emmy wins. Do you feel any sense of pride or achievement in, being a part of what I guess called this moment for
I'm
Asian
definitely
stories?
excited for Asian American stories to have more of a spotlight. I think the bigger breakthrough in some ways to me is that American audiences, because those are such American awards, are just getting more and more accustomed to reading subtitles, which I think is going to be exciting just for global cinema in general, because there's always been so many amazing movies from all over the world. So it's nice to see them become more normalized in our culture. And it's great to have these kinds of projects get more funding. Shōgun is like a pretty big show, so it's nice to see FX and Disney essentially like throw their support behind it financially. So I think that's exciting, and I think we live in a really globalist society, and so I think it's important for us, especially as Americans, where I think we can have blinders on to other parts of the world, to engage more with the history of other countries and cultures and how we all intersect and affect each other. So I think that almost excites me more in some ways than just Asian American representation, because I hope that we also expand Asian American representation. The 3 things we've just talked about are all about East Asian, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese. And I think it'll be nice to have more Southeast Asian representation, more South Asian representation. That's what I thought was exciting about RRR being a crossover hit. I think those things are great, just to remind us that we are, or we're, the most powerful, richest country in the world, and that means we also have a responsibility to other countries and places.
Yeah, so going back to what you were saying about, we're a globalist society, I think it's really interesting, given art is such a global thing in the film sense, TV sense, even music, though you've done some work in music, but I'll get to that in a little bit. And you touched on it a little bit with discussing subtitles. We've also seen just not even focusing specifically on Asian American stories, but also just other languages kind of being more prominently featured in popular shows in America, like Money Heist on Netflix being told in Spanish. So you touched on it a little bit again, but just in terms of audience attitudes or engagement, are you seeing some kind of a shift from your end? Because obviously you're on a different end than I am.
I actually feel like I'm a little bit weirdly in the same end as you. I think the only end that I would be different is that buyers and networks have more of an appetite to produce that kind of content, which is exciting. And that's really the only thing I sort of see a shift in. But when those things are popular, like when Squid Game is so popular, then Netflix is going to have more of an appetite to make things that are in a different language, particularly Korean. So I think it's shifting, but it's hard to say. I mean, a lot of film also catches up in a really slow way because the barrier to entry is so expensive that it takes time and it takes so long to get things made that I think we'll just keep seeing things in different languages, and then we might see it, things swing back and forth. But I think it's a positive for the world, and we're all watching more of the same things because of streaming, because Netflix is global and international like all these other streaming networks.
And I definitely think just with online forums and social media, it also just allows you to learn more. And then networks and companies are able to see, oh, this is getting really popular in one area, maybe we can bring it over here.
Yeah, totally.
And just from a writing standpoint, Shōgun was in 2 different languages. What's it like to try and write in 2 different languages?
That's a really good question. It's a pretty interesting process for us. So none of us are fluent in Japanese as a writer's room, and so we write all the scripts in English, and then on set they work with 3 different translators. one is a translator, and then two, like just a kind of normal translator, and then two specialize in Jidaigeki for Japanese cinema. So a lot of the language in Shōgun is written in that, the way that it's kind of like Shakespearean English, but for Japanese, but for media. So it's not exactly how anyone would talk, but it's how their media presents that kind of language. So there was a really long process where I believe, and I could get it wrong because I wasn't on set, but I believe Justin would make sure that all the scripts were locked 6 weeks before the shooting date, so they would have 6 weeks to translate. And then in post, what I think is really amazing and shows how hardworking Justin and Rachel both are, is that when they were done, they watched the whole show with the Japanese speaking producer who was fluent, and they rewrote all of the dialogue to make sure in subtitles it was accurate. So they really went through and went through the language with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that it really represented, because the actors would change things or subtle things would shift, so it didn't necessarily match the English we wrote, but the idea would be the same, and then they just perfected the subtitles.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to follow up with in terms of accuracy, because actors do make choices in the heat of the moment. But just kind of to stay on this area of culture, race, and language, your short film Astonishing Little Feet focused on the story of Houang Moi, and I think that was a really interesting story to tell, just in the sense that we don't hear as many of these individual stories of people that were of color but not necessarily black in the 19th century. So I was wondering what inspired you to tell this story. How did you discover it?
Yeah, I actually read a line in The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. And it was just one line in her book that said, the first documented Chinese woman to come to the United States was a woman named Houang Moi, who was brought by merchants to help sell goods because of her bound feet, basically. And I don't remember. It was something like that. And it just really struck me because I'd never heard of her. And just this idea that she was so instantly commodified felt like the origin story for how Asian American women are seen as hypersexualized and objectified. And so it felt like something I wish I'd known growing up. Like, I just didn't know that. And she was very, very famous. They brought her all over the United States. She met Andrew Jackson. So she really was probably the first Asian woman that most people in the United States ever saw. And so that really conveys kind of like that origin of how do you view Asian women? And because when you have bound feet, it's very hard to walk. So she was kind of stuck in a chair in a box with all these goods from China they were trying to sell, and people just come and look at her and be like, wow, look how small her feet are, which is like a circus act, basically. So it just felt like this origin story of some really harmful stereotypes that I think it's important to understand where they come from, so that you understand that none of those the way that people see you, especially I grew up in Michigan, so especially in a place like Michigan, which is predominantly white, where I grew up, it has nothing to do with me, but with these kind of preconceived notions that come from history. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight those issues in the film.
Yeah, no, I think it's just very interesting to go back and talk about, as you were saying a little bit, how these preconceived notions are just kind of built over time and, end up still permeating today.
Yeah.
And kind of staying in this area, you're a multiracial American, as am I, and I know just personally that gives me a bit of a unique way of looking at the world and experiencing different things. I was wondering how you apply that to, your work in any capacity.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm going to answer it that well, but I think that when you're from two different cultures, you sort of you're in the middle all the time. I think actually, in a weird anecdotal way, I think it's very interesting that so many Asian American authors who are ethnically Asian make their characters mixed race, and they almost always make them half white, half Asian. And I think that comes from this instinctive feeling in between, because you're both those things at the same time. So it's like a very good literary allegory, but it's kind of funny when that's your experience. And you're reading people kind of perceive your experience. But I think it just gives me probably a little bit of a unique perspective. I think it actually made me an interesting. Actually, all of the Asian women on Shōgun are mixed race, and I think that it gives us a little bit of a unique perspective because that show is about East meets West. It's kind of about being in the middle of cultures, and that's a little bit what it's like, I think, to be mixed race. But it's also so dependent on where you're from and how you grew up and where your family's from, and if you got to see that family. I grew up being able to go to Hong Kong and meet my family and know like my dad's family, but there's lots of people who never really get to like have that experience with their other culture. And so I think that all those things are important to consider. Yeah, I feel like the other thing that's interesting specifically for me being mixed race is I consider my mom like a pan-European American white lineage. And I think that's a very fascinating, unique culture that's very in contrast with like my father's culture. He's Chinese Vietnamese. And just the different ways they approach things. I feel like the contrast is extremely heightened for me, how different their attitudes towards things like community are, or even just relatives, like how they view family is so different. So I think that just inevitably permeates my work, but I don't necessarily feel like I totally know how, it probably just exists.
Yeah, no, I definitely would say on my end being, half African-American and half white, that I don't know exactly how it feeds in the way I approach things, but it's something that kind of lingers in the background.
Yeah,
but,
it's just always there.
Yeah, and just kind of you talking about Shōgun being a bit of an East meets West, I hadn't fully like considered that either, because Blackthorn, and not even just him, but the Catholics coming in, definitely there's a lot of just kind of, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, conflict, but also not fully conflict in the sense that there's the Catholic regents in there too. So there's a lot going on, a lot of mixing, and that I guess is just representative of what was going on at that time.
Yeah. It's historically accurate.
Yeah, very complex, just period in general. But before going to a bit of a lighter topic, I wanted to talk about In Full Bloom, your short film that touched on grief in the sense of a black hole. And I just was interested in learning about that one, kind of what inspired you to go tell that story.
That was inspired by, I feel like this sense of loss and about the memory. It's inspired by kind of my inability to really ever know my grandmother in some ways, because she passed away when I was 12, and I just have heard stories about her my whole life. But it's not just her, it's like access to my dad's culture. Yeah. She grew up in Vietnam and then married my grandfather and moved to China with him and then moved to Hong Kong. So she sort of escaped like two different really intense political situations. And I just think about her a lot and like what she would think, but I would never really know. And so I think in some ways that's just an allegory for a lot of things. I think what I like about that movie, or what I'm proud of, is I think you can put a lot of things into it. It doesn't need to mean one thing to one person. So it's about losing someone you love, but I think it's also just about losing access to historical memory and family memory, and also just losing your memory. Like I think that also pervades. And then I think a lot of people who are of the Asian diaspora, and especially the Chinese diaspora, have a tendency toward hoarding, because there's this sense of like you can lose everything and you might be hungry. There are a lot of famines in China specifically, and a lot of Asia. So it means that you just like want to hold on to whatever you can, because you know that it can leave, and that sort of is this process that's hard of letting go. I mean, I know not everyone's a hoarder, but there's a lot of jokes about like every Chinese family has like a room full of bags that they have never thrown away, or like the boxes. Like anytime I have a nice box, I'm always like, does anybody want this box? Like it's really nice. Like we shouldn't throw it away. We should just keep it, because maybe we need to put our other stuff into the box. So it was just a little bit about all those little like feelings of just, and I wanted it to feel mythical and surreal, because I actually don't know. Like I can't claim to be an expert on Chinese or Vietnamese culture. That's something that's weird about being Asian American, or just being in this weird interstitial space where I both know things about it, but also I've never, I didn't grow up there. And so I feel connected to it and distanced from it. And so I wanted it to have a bit of a surreal quality, because that's kind of how it is in my mind. It's a little bit surreal.
Yeah, and I think just staying on this, but also tying it to Shōgun, you were talking about holding on to things, and John Blackthorn's kind of trying to do that when, Fuji's ready to go leave and be a nun, for example. But I think that show just is very interesting, especially putting that in context with In Full Bloom, kind of almost the all-consuming nature of grief at times as opposed to others. Because in Full Bloom, everything's falling into that black hole, and so that's literally consuming everything.
Yeah, I think it can be this overwhelming feeling where you don't have perspective and you just can't really look outside yourself.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think going back to just this holding on to things and, you could lose everything at one point. Also just houses and things, in Shōgun being able to be destroyed and rebuilt very quickly.
Yeah.
I think that also goes back to the points you've been making, just that you can lose everything very quickly.
I think it's important to like think about the foundation that Buddhism and Confucianism has in a lot of Asian culture, which is just a sense of it's a cliche, but there's some truth to it where like life is suffering, things are impermanent, you're not going to be here forever. And I think that is a contrast I had growing up mixed race, where my dad was much more open about talking about death than I think a lot of people I knew, and it was more accepting of it, and it was more of a part of our life that my parents were going to die and that like everyone's going to die. And I think a lot of American society, the way we embalm people, the way we kind of put people to the side when they're dying, or it shows our inability to really confront the reality of death and accept it, which is also something that I enjoyed about working on Shōgun, because I think those are just themes and things we all have to contend with at all times, and they're difficult.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's very much aware of the looming presence of that, especially just given the amount of, combat that's going on in that show. And just people are being lost, almost left and right throughout the first season at least. So
Yeah.
I think it is very present. Everybody's very aware of that. But to pivot now to the lighter note that I said we'd get to, you've done a lot of work with music videos for artists like Mitski and Hanavu, and I'm interested in learning a little bit about if you have noticed any big differences in working on a music video versus traditional film and TV.
Oh, there are so many differences. Music videos are really an independent film space. They're not unionized, they're not structured. The budgets are incredibly low, and they've only gotten lower. In the 90s, David Fincher and Michael Bay probably got budgets of $1 to $1.5 million. A really big budget video right now for a pretty big artist would be between $300,000 and $1 million, and that's 20 years later. So most music videos are probably $50,000 or less, and so most people working on them are being paid very little or not being paid at all. They're volunteering their time, they're asking their friends to volunteer their time, and so music videos are very much in an independent film space, and that's how they should be seen. What's strange about them, and where there is an intersection, is that like film and television and commercials, there is technically a client. And so that, and I would argue in independent film there is too, because you still have to deal with financiers. But ultimately you are making a video for someone else in a label. So they're very different in terms of just like the way that they're made. And music videos are very I think disrespected, frankly, in the Hollywood film community. I think that there's a little bit of a dismissiveness towards them, and I think a lot of music video directors are some of the hardest working, most insane, mentally unwell people who are just willing to do something really crazy for no money and no time just because they love making something so much. And I think that's why right now, at least in the American Hollywood entertainment space, two of the most sought after directors would be Daniels and Hiro Murai, and they came from music videos. And I think it's because we approach things with a pretty intense passion, but it does tend to get really overlooked in the independent film space and in entertainment. So they're quite different, but I always advocate for music video directors because they tend to be, I think, a little more creative and resourceful because of what they're doing with the money they have.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, do you think that music videos give you more creative freedom than typical filmmaking?
It really depends on the artist and the label, but the ones that I personally choose to do, I really only do them when I have a lot of creative freedom. I try to do music videos where I get to do something that's interesting to me, and part of that is because there's not a lot of money and I'm not paying myself on these projects. So it's not worth it to me to do them if I don't have creative input and say and like Final Cut and stuff like that. But if you're doing a video for someone like Bad Bunny or Beyonce, then they're going to have a lot more influence, so it's just picking the mode of production that you're kind of more interested in working in. But yeah, they can definitely be more creative.
I think especially, looking at your videos like Happy by Mitski, which has a massive plot twist at the end, and you're able to follow this story without really the words of the characters. You're just listening to the music played over the video, as well as Care by Hanavu being told in reverse. I think there's some really interesting things that you do in your music video work that is fascinating, kind of can lend itself to that, depending on the artist's creative freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I love the inventiveness of music videos, and I also love the challenge of it. I think it's really important if you're want to be a filmmaker to be able to tell things without dialogue and to tell things as visually as possible, because dialogue can be very important. I'm literally a television writer. Most of our scenes are people talking. But if you can do it without dialogue, I really think you're hitting something that's a little different, and music videos lend itself to that for sure. It's just really good practice. I really started doing them because I didn't come from a lot of money, and they were a way to get a small budget to do projects and make short films in practice. And also just get built-in press, because a lot of times when you make a short film, like, it's very possible nobody sees it. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but it's also really hard and it's very exploitative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just in terms of, do you have any like relationship with music that kind of drew you to that as well? You talked a little bit about the money aspect of it, but was there any kind of love for music at the beginning?
Yeah, when I was applying to college, my college essay was about my love of music and like indie music, and I was very much obsessed with music. Probably more music was my first love than film in some ways. I also grew up playing the viola and the piano, and so I never was in a band or anything, but I just really loved music. And so it was kind of a natural transition for me to find these artists that I really admired and thought were great and reach out to them and try to do videos for them. And I love supporting them. And honestly, for as bad as music videos directors are treated, artists have it really bad too. Like, they are in a really tough position. Unless you come from a lot of intergenerational wealth, basically a lot of labels will basically give you like a loan that you have to pay back over time. Oh. So it's a really tough situation to be in. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but if you look up the deals, it's very tough to be a musician and make money right now.
Yeah, I think that's also just very interesting. You talked about the beginning of music videos. You know, when you look at like Thriller, which probably had a pretty good sized budget, and you've got Michael Jackson in there, and then you compare that with, you know, some artists that are probably just trying to get a video out there, hope they get some traction going, that it's a very interesting contrast. And you talked about the budgets that videos would get. That I think might be the most interesting.
Well,
contrast.
I mean, it has to do with Napster and the fall of Tower Records. Like, a lot of this has to do with the rise of streaming, where as soon as people could pirate music, people didn't buy records, so nobody has money to make music videos. And that has a lot to do with why the budgets have completely crashed, and a lot of us in the music video community just call it the Wild Wild West.
Okay, yeah. Wild Wild West is kind of an interesting name, but it makes sense given what you've been saying. Yeah. And to talk a little bit about what you've going on for the future, you're a producer on Shōgun Season 2 and have a movie for A24 that you're writing. Can you tell me a little bit about these projects or any others that you currently have going on?
Yeah, I wrote a movie for Panos Cosmatos. It's a pretty crazy sci-fi movie. I'm not supposed to say more because, you know, but I'm excited about it. We'll see if it goes into production. It hasn't yet, for the people who won't stop DMing me. Sorry. And the Shōgun Season 2 I'm really excited about. I'm also developing a movie to direct. Hopefully I get to do that in the next few years. You never know. And I have a TV show in development with A24, but I just can't tell you guys anything more than that, and I'm sorry.
I mean, that makes sense.
It's
I thought it was
like
worth the ask. But in terms of Shōgun Season 2, do you guys kind of just approach it the same way you did Season 1, or do you feel like, you know, given your massive Emmy wins and things like that, is there any kind of different attitude going into this than you had for Season 1?
For me personally, the biggest difference is that we just don't have source material. And I find that really liberating and freeing, actually, because we just get to use history and read a lot of historical research that our research team does and sort of invent things. And I'm having a really good time with that. It's like a nice contrast. The book was really fun to work with, but it's really fun to be just making stuff up again. And for me, the awards, I don't put as much stock into that stuff as other people, and I don't really know why, but like, I'm so grateful and honored that the show's been received so much, but I also just feel like that doesn't change the work that we would have to do anyway, because we're all just trying to make the best show we can.
Yeah, no, I think I'm very excited to see Toranaga in terms of the next season, where he's going to go, especially now that there is no source material and you guys can take it wherever you really want to. I mean, obviously in a realistic sense, but and then I like to ask this last question, just in terms of your, you know, wide variety of work, is there any one piece that you're kind of particularly attached to or really love above all else?
I don't think there is one that I feel particularly attached to. I mean, I will say, because I am a staffed writer, I don't feel as attached to the television shows that I work on, just because in my world, my job is to really fulfill Justin and Rachel's vision on Shōgun. So I love Shōgun, I love the characters, but that very much feels like I'm helping them do the thing they really want to do. So I definitely feel more attached to like my own work and the music. And the music videos, I feel like they're all mine because I really do come up with the ideas, and I try to work with artists who are as collaborative as Mitski and Hanavu, who are really open-minded about what I make. So I think I feel pretty equally proud and attached to like almost all of my stuff. Even like, I think some people would expect me to say the short films more than the music videos, but I really love them all equally because I treat each music video kind of like a passion project anyway. So that's what they are.
Yeah, like labor of love.
They're all labors of love because there's no money. And I think that's, of course, some videos have money, but a lot of them don't.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that you almost wrote your you did write your college essay about music. So obviously there's been a love for it that goes back a little bit. That is all the time we have today. I'd like to say first, thank you for just joining me today. I loved learning about your life, your career. That's inspired myself and such a wide audience across the world. So I very much enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, yeah. That's all we have for this WOLV TV Spotlight. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.